Then a rogue rises up, roars amid great acclaim. State and nation are God, and I am state and nation. Therefore, I am God. Could you fail to contradict him? You would have to contradict him, and so you would soon find yourself a political agitator. Inevitable though it would be, to be sure, nevertheless, the burden of guilt would not be upon you, but upon that rogue. Because the borderline between religion and politics would have been wiped out. From a mere popular preacher until that hour, you would emerge a political figure day by day, without even realizing it, and your church would loom up as a center of political opposition. This is the story of Pastor Niemoller.
The Anarcho-Christian Podcast, evaluating the relationship between the Christian and the state.
Give us a king to rule us when you're gone. His life's work had been to help the people understand it's not the role of a man to rule over other men.
Hi everybody, welcome back to the show. So back in episode 55, we went over the Barmen Declaration, which was a 1934 document written by German Christian pastors and theologians that opposed the nationalization and the unification of the church with the Nazi Party. In the episode, we went over the Declaration, which was primarily written by Karl Barth, but also touched on some other instrumental figures that were all a part of the group, the Emergency League, which was later better known as the Confessing Church, and it's the group that produced the Declaration in Barmen, Germany. The most recognized is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but we also touched on a pastor named Martin Niemoller, who played a very large part in the early organizing of these pastors against the Third Reich. Pastor Niemoller is best known for his 1946 quote or poem. First, they came for the socialist, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. So this poem was from 1946, just after the 1945 end of World War II, which we also talked about in episode 78. Obviously, I'm happy that Niemoller's name and words are memorialized. But the more I dig into his story, I'm a little frustrated that we don't know more about his contributions prior to the war. So let's begin to fix that here, because, as I'm sure you'll see, not only is Niemoller's contributions important to church history, but it could be equally important to Christians as an inspiration for today and into the future. I mentioned he was an important part of the 1934 Barmen Declaration, but I think we need to understand the timeline a little better to really understand the resistance that Niemoller was a part of, and what he went through between the 1930s and 40s. Something I'm always trying to emphasize is the lead up to events. We tend to look at World War II from 1941 and on, the height of the war, and after the entry of the US. A more studied person will go back to 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and officially kicked off the New World War. However, there is so much we can learn from the lead-up to the event. And indeed, it's in a nearly 20-year lead-up that we see a progression or digression, depending on how you want to look at it. But it's in that time that we tend to look to, along with the later years of the Third Reich, as an early warning to political movements today. And I know it gets old, everyone comparing everything to Nazis today. But there are some very significant and realistic takeaways from the early rise to the Third Reich. that isn't limited to left versus right, Republican versus Democrat, rhetorical infighting. When this happens, it's a lot like crying wolf, and then devalues anyone's legitimate warnings. And it's now just hyperbolic ranting that's just a part of this my team or our side arguments and excuses we tend to make when the politics get involved and take priority over objective morality. Anyways, let's turn the dial back to 1919 and see if we can get a better understanding of the dangerous consequences involved in the decades-long consistent actions of Pastor Niemoller. The year 1919 saw the creation of the German Workers' Party by Anton Drexler, about a year after the end of World War I. During the first year of the German Workers' Party, a 30-year-old decorated veteran of World War I attended a meeting and quickly became a leader in the party due to his energy and his oratorical skills. His name was Adolf Hitler. The next year, the party was renamed the National Socialist Party, which is better known today as the Nazi Party. Under Hitler's leadership, the Nazi Party would assume total control of Germany in 1933. Over those 13 years, Germany and the Nazi Party saw some very historically important events. At the start of the Nazi Party, Hitler drew up a 25-point program that called for Germany to abandon the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was the peace treaty that was signed between the defeated Germany and the victorious allies of World War I. The treaty held Germany responsible for the Great War, and it is commonly held today that the treaty's terms and penalties were harsh. And I want to stress that because a lot of people are not aware of these details, but mainstream historical sources will attest to that. And it isn't something that is just held by Nazi sympathizers or something like that. The penalties for Germany were losses of territory, massive reparations, and demilitarization. Additional objective historical points on this is that it was a humiliation for Germany, and the resulting economic hardships the treaty created directly led to the ultra-nationalistic sentiment of the German people. This was the perfect storm for the rise of the Nazi Party. So within a few years of assuming the leadership within the Nazi Party and drawing up the 25-point program, Hitler organized and attempted an armed coup of the Bavarian government. It failed after 16 Nazi Party members and 4 police officers were killed. Hitler fled and was later arrested for high treason, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but was released after only serving about a year. During that year, Hitler dictated most of the first volume of Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. This book would later be published with 2 volumes over the next couple of years. And in 1933, during his first year in office, the book sold 1 million copies. Mein Kampf was Hitler's autobiography and explanation of his ideology. In it, he laid out his one-race plan for Germany and his anti-Semitism. When Hitler was released from jail, he reassumed leadership of the Nazi Party. Between his publishing of Mein Kampf in 1925 and 1926, and his appointment of Chancellor in Germany in 1933, Hitler had to do a lot to rebuild the Nazi Party. Since the failed coup, the Nazi Party had been banned in Bavaria, but after Hitler met with the Prime Minister and promised that they would respect the democratic process in the future, the ban was lifted. But in February of 1925, about a month after the ban was lifted, Hitler gave an inflammatory speech and was barred from making public speeches for the next couple of years. In 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed, and this had a major impact on Germany as millions of people then lost work and several banks collapsed. The Nazi Party seized this political opportunity that was provided by the Great Depression And over the next couple of years, the Nazi Party became a major political party, and Hitler would eventually become appointed chancellor after backing from prominent politicians and businessmen. Very quickly after becoming chancellor, we see major political events happen. But of course, the severity is always in hindsight, as there were always, quote, good reasons for these pragmatic authoritarian laws, acts, and decrees that stripped away rights and empowered the government. So check this out. This is really some of the craziest stuff, and I wasn't aware of it before researching more of this episode. But Hitler lost the election for president of Germany to Paul von Hindenburg. He was soon reluctantly appointed chancellor January 30th, 1933, by Hindenburg, apparently after two parliamentary elections failed to form a majority government. Hitler was working hard to have the Nazis become the majority in the government, but was running into a lot of opposition from the political opponents. After a political stalemate, even though the Nazis had the most seats, Hitler asked Hindenburg to dissolve the parliament, which was called the Reichstag. Elections were scheduled for early March of 1933. But on February 27th, the Reichstag building was set on fire. Everyone blamed each other for it. The communists blamed the Nazis blamed the communists. But regardless of party affiliation or lone arson, Hindenburg signed, with Hitler's urging, the Reichstag fire decree the next day. The decree was drafted by the Nazi Party, and it suspended basic rights and allowed detention without trial. And if this act sounds completely crazy, I want to point out that it was legal according to their constitution, which gave the president the power to take emergency measures to protect public safety and order. But maybe it's not that crazy if you're familiar with things like Abraham Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus on April 27, 1861, which gave the military authorities the power to silence dissenters. These dissenters that might exercise their free speech in opposition to the president could be arrested and detained without indictment or arraignment. Or maybe it's not so crazy if you're familiar with the Patriot Act of 2001, which made it legal for law enforcement to spy on Americans and search property without warrant, consent, or knowledge, as well as authorizing the indefinite detention of immigrants without trial. The list really could go on, but of course, it's all for public safety and order, right? And in the name of public safety and order, in 1933, the activities of the Communist Party of Germany, the Nazis' main opposition, was suppressed as about 4,000 members were arrested. But even though the Nazis gained a large increase, they still didn't get the majority that they needed from the election on March 6th, the next week. Later that month, the new parliament met together and Hitler presented the Enabling Act, which was officially titled The Law to Remedy the Distress of People and Reich. These laws always have such noble names, don't they? Who would be opposed to a remedy for distress? But if passed, this law would give Hitler's cabinet the power to enact laws that could deviate from the Constitution, without the consent of the Parliament, for 4 years. This would require 2/3 majority vote to pass, but with the help of the Reichstag Fire Act, the Nazis were able to arrest all 81 communist deputies, and the act passed 2 days later with a vote of 444 to 94. With the Enabling Act and the Reichstag Fire Decree, Hitler was now essentially a dictator. It's at this point that we can see the start of Niemoller's poem really coming into focus here. First, they came for the socialists. The Social Democratic Party was banned and their assets seized in the next month or so. Then they came for the trade unionists. By May, all trade unions were forced to dissolve. The trade union leaders were arrested, and some were sent to concentration camps. And by July, the Nazi Party was declared the only legal political party in Germany. Between June and July of the next year, 1934, Hitler purged the entire leadership of the Nazis' paramilitary wing called the SA in an event called the Night of the Long Knives. These leaders were rounded up, arrested, and shot, along with other political opponents of Hitler. So in a little over a year, Hitler went from being appointed chancellor to de facto dictator of Germany, arresting and murdering anyone that stood in his path. But keep in mind that many Germans believed Hitler was restoring order, as he and those laws stated. And he was doing it all legally, I guess. In August of 1934, President Hindenburg would die of lung cancer at the age of 86. The day before the president died, the cabinet enacted the Law Concerning the Highest State Office of the Reich, which stated that upon Hindenburg's death, the office of president would be dissolved and its powers would merge with the chancellor's. So on August 2nd, 1934, Hitler became the head of the state and government and would become known from then on as the Fuhrer.
Adolf Hitler, leader of Nazi Germany, is the man who has accomplished this revival, and Adolf Hitler takes the salute, his generals and Goering behind him. It is not the manpower of the modern German army that impresses most, but the mechanical weapons of warfare with which it is now equipped. Squadrons of the latest fighting machines roar overhead in formation. And on land, the latest tanks also parade their sinister strength. In massed array they wheel on the parade ground, presenting an impressive spectacle for the thousands of proud spectators. In this vivid camera impression of the great Nazi rally, you can judge for yourself the extent of German rearmament. The European armies of today present an awe-inspiring spectacle, but at the same time a singularly depressing one. For the world is rearming, and it almost seems as if the lessons of the World War were forgotten. Germany's weapons are the last word in scientific war material. Her air force is powerful and efficient, and her guns are equally modern.
So while I was digging into Pastor Niemoller and this phrase, God is my Fuhrer, I came across an article published in Time magazine, December 23rd, 1940. For all the issues that we have with the internet today, it is really an amazing thing to be able to find these digitally archived articles from so long ago. This article is informative and also very shocking because a lot of this pre-war and early war stuff is passed over for the epic war stories and campaigns. But in it, we see a lot of details of civil disobedience from churches against the state, as well as we see the state punishing those pastors with prison, compulsory service, fines, confiscation of collections, regulating ordinations, and an attempted assassination. So let's just dive into this Time article from 1940 and see what it says about Pastor Niemoller and the Nazi Party, and remember where this takes place in the whole timeline of things, that this is the end of 1940.
We think you will find interesting these enlightening pictures of Germany's newly equipped army and the consequent revival of the military spirit which now apparently permeates the nation.
German Martyrs, Monday, December 23rd, 1940, Time magazine. Not you, Herr Hitler, but God is my Fuhrer. These defiant words of Pastor Martin Niemoller were echoed by millions of Germans, and Hitler raged. It is Niemoller or I. So this second Christmas of Hitler's war finds Niemoller and upwards of 200,000 other Christians, some estimates run as high as 800,000, behind the barbed wire of the frozen Nazi concentration camps. Here, men bear mute witness that the Christ, whose birth the outside world celebrates unthinkingly at Christmas, can still inspire a living faith for which men and women even now endure imprisonment, torture, and death as bravely as in centuries past. More than 80% of the prisoners in the concentration camps are not Jews, but Christians. And the best tribute to the spirit of Germany's Christians comes from a Jew and agnostic, the world's most famous scientist, Albert Einstein. He says, "Being a lover of freedom, when the revolution came in Germany, I looked to the universities to defend it, knowing that they had always boasted of their devotion to the cause of truth. But no, the universities immediately were silenced. When I looked to the great editors of the newspapers whose flaming editorials in days gone by had proclaimed their love of freedom, but they, like the universities, were silenced in a few short weeks. Only the church stood squarely across the path of Hitler's campaign for suppressing truth. I never had any special interest in the church before. But now I feel a great affection and admiration because the church alone has had the courage and persistence to stand for intellectual truth and moral freedom. I am forced thus to confess that what I once despised, I now praise unreservedly." The next section is titled The Failures of Force. Of the fate of German Christians, Dr. Henry Smith Leiper, Secretary of the World Council of Churches, says, "This is one of the most subtle and terrible persecutions in all history. But the blood of martyrs is the seed of faith. Though the Nazis have jailed over 10,000 pastors, priests, and monks for long or short periods, an unknown number have been beaten to death. The churches stand far higher in German esteem today than they did in the easygoing 20s. Church congregations have grown remarkably. Sales of the Bible have shot up from 830,000 copies in 1933 to 1,225,000 in 1939, topping Mein Kampf by about 200,000. From Hitler's viewpoint, the most dangerous aspect of Christian resistance is the refusal of thousands of churches, both Protestant and Catholic, to pray for a Nazi victory. The Gestapo can silence all open attacks from the pulpit, can imprison all outspoken pastors, and forbid bishops to write pastoral letters, but it cannot make them pray for Nazi success. That situation is unparalleled in a nation at war. Even the Sfars Corps, organ of the elite guard, admits it. The spiritual gentlemen write as though they want to make our soldiers dislike the war. They do not find a single word to say about the purpose of the war. They do not pray for victory. Pastors Schutt and Krom of Applerbeck are quoted as saying that there are sufficient enemies all around us, and that maybe the English and French are not the worst. In Cologne, the Nazis were able to get Catholic churches to pray not for victory, but for our soldiers. The prayer also included a point reference to Saint Conrad of Parzum, a Bavarian monk whom Pope Pius XI canonized in 1934 as an example of deep humility as opposed to Nazism's racial pride, which is neither Christian nor human. In Munster, the massive adroit bishop, Count Clemens August von Galen, instead of telling his diocese to pray for victory, ordered daily recitation of the prayer, "Lord grant us peace. Queen of Heaven, pray for us." Prayers and persecutions. Actually, many a churchman inside Germany prays privately for a Nazi defeat, or at least a check to Hitler's power. Said a Catholic news dispatch from Geneva last month, it is generally anticipated that in the case of a victorious war, the Nazi regime would no longer hesitate to wipe out all vestiges of Christianity in Germany and try to establish a national church under Nazi supervision, which would be entirely based on the pagan concept of blood and soil. Taking a leaf from the Nazi verboten Old Testament, where King David got rid of Bathsheba's husband by having him set in the forefront of the hottest battle, that he may be smitten and die, the Nazis mobilized over 55% of Germany's Protestant pastors for army service, most of them as privates. They singled out confessional pastors especially. In some districts, 75% of the recalcitrant confessional pastors were drafted for frontline service. Another favorite Nazi device is confiscating the salary of pastors and priests whom they suspected of opposing them. Practically all the 5,000 confessional pastors have suffered from this. At one church in Prussia, a confessional pastor read an official announcement that the collection would be taken by the government. He added, "If you can give with your conscience, do so." Then he announced the sale of pamphlets nominally priced at 2 cents each. "You have read them already," he said, "but you can give them to your friends." The regular collection, sacked by the Nazis, netted less than $2. The sale of 20 2-cent pamphlets netted $20. In 1939, the Nazis closed over 700 German monasteries and convents. Last month, they expelled 60 Catholic priests from their parishes. The work of scores of other priests and pastors has been halted by confining them to their homes or forbidding them to preach. Of the 1,000 young Protestant seminaries in 1939, only 10 were permitted ordination after their views had been examined by state officials. The other 900 refused to Nazify their faith, went into training in underground confessional seminaries for certificates, which confessional congregations will accept in lieu of ordination. Cut off from any possibility of salaries from Nazi-levied church taxes, they must live on the scant $45 a month, which the Confessional Synod can allow them. Nazis versus Nazarenes. An exiled Nobel Prizeman, Thomas Mann, said last week, "There can be no real peace between the cross and the swastika. National Socialism is essentially unchristian and anti-Christian. Though the conflict between Christianity and Nazism seems inevitable now, it did not seem so when Hitler came into power. Catholics and Protestants alike helped this coup d'etat. Martin Niemoller himself supported him, and one of Hitler's first acts as Chancellor was to declare, 'In the two Christian creeds lie the most important factors for the preservation of the German people.' Only in secret did he tell his confidant Hermann Röchning, 'The parsons will be made to dig their own graves. They will betray their God to us. They will betray anything for the sake of their miserable little jobs and incomes. I can guarantee that they will replace the cross with our swastika.'" Hitler won his religious Munichs over Germany's 21 million Catholics and 40 million Protestants in the first 6 months of his power. The Vatican signed a concordat negotiated by Pope Pius XII, who was then Cardinal Pacelli, Papal Secretary of State, with him on July 20th, 1933. By it, Germany guaranteed the Church full freedom in its faith, property, and organizations in return for the Vatican's pledge that each bishop would promise to honor the constitutional government and to cause the clergy of my diocese to honor it. With the escape clause, the Nazis have since torn all 33 articles of the Concordat into shreds, yelling, "It's constitutional," every time the Church objected. Shortly after he got his Concordat, Hitler got his Protestant Reich bishop he wanted. In the spring of 1933, Germany's Protestants, Lutheran, Reformed, voluntarily merged into the German Evangelical Church. To head it, the Nazis nominated Army Chaplain Ludwig Müller, a friend of Hitler and leader of the Nazified Deutsche Christen, the German Christians. By November, the evangelicals realized that Hitler's hand-picked candidate was out to Nazify their church, crucify Christian doctrine, apply the Fuhrer principle to church government, and the Aryan paragraph to church personnel. Resistance flared up all over the Reich, and the newly united church split sharply into 3 groups. 1. The Deutsche Christians, who, like Reich Bishop Müller, wanted to make the church the obedient instrument of the state, and who have never numbered more than 3,000 pastors. 2. The Lutheran Council, some 9,000 moderates led by Dr. August Mehrens, Bishop of Hanover, who did not want to be dominated by the state, i.e. the Nazis, but wanted some connection maintained between church and state. 3. The Confessional Synod, whose 5,000 pastors were militantly opposed to Nazi domination, fought it by every means in their power. A month later, Catholicism also began to strike back, led by raw-boned, outspoken Cardinal von Fuhrer, Archbishop of Munich. In a series of Advent sermons that packed St. Michael's Church, he condemned the false choice that the Nazis had tried to place before Catholics. The choice between Germanism and disloyalty. His Eminence thundered, "Let us not forget that we were saved not by German blood, but by the blood of Christ." Cardinal von Fuhrer narrowly missed a Nazi bullet in 1934. In 1938, a Nazi mob smashed the windows of his palace. Now 71, he is in ill health, but he still leads Germany's Catholics in the resistance to Hitler. So vigorous was confessional and Lutheran council opposition to Reich Bishop Niemoller that Hitler soon shelved him, presently gave his powers to the Minister of Church Affairs, Hans Kerrl. Minister Kerrl's creed: "The primacy of the state over the church must be recognized. The question of the divinity of Christ is ridiculous and unessential." A new authority, Adolf Hitler, has risen as to what Christ and Christianity really are. To Minister Kerrl, Adolf Hitler is the Jesus Christ as well as the Holy Ghost of the Fatherland. The Deutsch Christian element among Protestants, though in numerical minority, has flourished temporarily with Nazi backing, but its churches are 3/4 empty. Typical Deutsch Christian bishop is Dr. Martin Sass of Thuringia, who declares, "We would still go on with the Fuhrer even if he closed the church doors before us. In Germany, there is no life except with the Fuhrer. The present-day task of theological science is to provide a religious foundation for the new state ethics." This neo-paganism the confessionals have fought fervently, the Lutheran Council less uncompromisingly. A reef-dodging diplomat, Bishop Meherens, is one of the 3 pre-Hitler Protestant bishops who has held on to his post, typifies an attitude of something less than martyrdom. Under him, middle-of-the-road Protestantism's steady declaration has been, "Our bishop and council remain the legal authority of our church. The Lord of the Christian Church is Christ, not Hitler." One man of courage. Living martyr and symbol of Christian resistance in Germany, both to Germans and the whole world, is Pastor Niemoller. The gaunt, blunt, unbending hero of World War I, who won the Iron Cross for his exploits as a submarine commander. He sank 55,000 tons of Allied shipping. He was pastor of the swank Jesus Christus Kirche in Berlin's socialite suburb Dahlem, and led the confessional synod's attack on Nazism, until clapped into jail in July 1937 for misuse of the pulpit. The court freed him when he came to trial in February 1938, but the Gestapo promptly hustled him off to the concentration camp at Sachsenhausen. There he remains, all rumors to the contrary notwithstanding, having refused release, offered to him on condition that he promised to cease preaching. Halted last fortnight in Mexico City, after Germans threatened to bomb the theater, was the showing of the anti-Nazi film Pastor Hall. It freely parallels Pastor Niemoller's career in opposition, shows a small-town Lutheran parson learning what the new Nazi gospel means, suffering in a concentration camp, escaping for a final sermon to his flock before being shot. Pastor Hall, says Dr. Leiper, underestimates, not overestimates, the terror. At Sachsenhausen, Pastor Niemoller has been placed on a regime of half rations, double heavy labor, solitary confinement, rock breaking, road building, ditch digging, harsh treatment are fast wearing him out. He has been beaten, but has told his wife on the rare visits she is permitted that he has seen others beaten unconscious. "When I write the address concentration camp Sachsenhausen," said his daughter, "then I am always very proud." Priest and pastor. The next-door cell of Niemoller's is occupied by Jesuit Rupert Mayer. Like Pastor Niemoller, Priest Mayer was a World War I hero, supported the Nazis in their early days, opposed them violently when they showed their anti-Christian colors. Said Jesuit mayor in 1937, "It is better for a priest to be shot down in Spain than to see his faith being dragged into the dirt in Germany." The Gestapo promptly arrested him. He was given a suspended sentence by the court, rearrested by the Gestapo. Like Niemoller, he has refused release offered him on condition that he refrain from preaching. Priest Mayer and Pastor Niemoller see each other occasionally in the courtyard and have become good friends. Their friendship is symbolic of a new bond which is growing between Protestants and Catholics throughout the Reich. Where heretofore the two creeds have been divided, as in few other lands, by bloody memories of the 30-Year War. When 30 confessional pastors were arrested in Prussia, slender, steel-nerved, aristocratic Count Conrad von Preysing, Roman Catholic Bishop of Berlin, directed that prayers for their safety be offered in every church of his diocese. Flat as a finning has fallen the neo-pagan celebration of the Nordic Yule at the winter solstice, sponsored by Dr. Alfred Rosenberg and other extremist Nazis as a substitute for Christmas. Not since the Reformation has the Christian feeling in the Reich been more intense. This Christmastide will see millions of Germans quietly celebrating a Christian Christmas. Protestants and Catholics alike will sing their best beloved of all carols, Silent Night, in the fervent hope that the silent night will be followed by the dawn. A message from prison. It was in his fortress prison after his comic opera misfired in 1923 that Adolf Hitler wrote Mein Kampf and planned the Nazi Revolution. If Hitler falls after World War II, his successor may even now be among the thousands who are passing this Christmas with Niemoller and Mayer in the concentration camps. And from his prison cell, the Advent message that Martin Niemoller smuggled out last December reached the U.S. in time for another Christmas. There is one thing I want to ask all of you, that we give no place to weariness, to capitulation. There are those who would persuade us that the suffering of our church is a sign that it follows a perverted way. To that we reply confidently that the apostles have borne witness to the contrary. In their strength, let us go forward on the way, in his footsteps, unconcerned with the censor of men, but with the peace of Christ in our hearts and with praise of God on our lips. So help us God. So there was a lot to take away from this article, but there were a few that really made me stop and think. Did you notice it documented that Hitler appeared to be very supportive of the church at first? He gave them special state status and state support, but when pastors realized he'd turned against them, it was too late. The hindsight answer here is to not let it get that far by keeping the church separate from the state to begin with. And that starts with the individuals. It's not just about going along with a congregation or a church committee or some sort of corporate organization. Did you also notice the tendency of the church to deify the state and the state's leader? Some pretty alarming statements from the church leaders, but we tend to see that sort of stuff play out with presidents in American history studies and politicians every time the election machine gets warmed up. And another thing that I thought was interesting, sometimes the existence of Jewish concentration camps are used to retconned the U.S. involvement in World War II. I realize this is anecdotal, but if you've had similar experiences, this Time magazine article from 1940, a year before Pearl Harbor, acknowledges the existence of these concentration camps for Jews and Christians. So if someone says the U.S. wasn't aware of the Jewish people being forced into these concentration camps until the U.S. joined the war, that is incorrect. And if they say that the U.S. was involved to liberate the concentration camps, that is also incorrect. Again, I know this is anecdotal, and not everyone has had this misconception, but it is out there. And if you run into it, this article is a great resource to cut through that rhetoric.
National Socialism, the anniversary of the day in January 1933 when President Hindenburg called a new leader to take charge of the German people. How little did the world dream then what those 6 years would bring. Today, Germany regards those 6 years as a mounting climax of achievement. Today, Germany celebrates by lighting the Berlin night sky with 1 million torches.
So Niemoller was mentioned quite a bit in this article. With the actions of Hitler's state against pastors, it doesn't surprise that he was arrested and eventually thrown into a concentration camp when we hear his defiant phrase, "God is my Fuhrer." It's worth looking back on that. I've tried to imagine what church was like in 1930s Germany. As the pastor preached facing his congregation, seeing uniformed Reich officers standing by, listening to every word, waiting for you to say something against the state. Niemoller was eventually arrested in 1937, released, and then immediately rearrested by the Gestapo. After that, his last 28 sermons were compiled into a book entitled God is my Fuhrer. Now, I want to take a minute here and thank everyone that was a part of my research for this. I had to have help finding the PDFs for these sermons, because this is pretty obscure by this point. Also, because of the help of the patrons, I was able to purchase the only physical copy of God is my Fuhrer that I could find online. This being the only physical copy I could find, it was a little pricier than any book I've purchased before. So thank you, patrons, for making that happen. When I received the book, I was surprised to see that the acclaimed German author Thomas Mann actually wrote the preface for this book. And there's a lot of things from this preface and from the sermons within this book that's not only just as historically informative as this Time article, but a lot of it confirms what the article said. Mann was an outspoken critic of the German government in the pre-war years. In 1933, Mann was traveling in France when his children informed him that it would not be safe for him to return back to Germany. So, with the exception of a couple of children, the Mann family immigrated to Switzerland. But with German advancements in 1939, Thomas Mann immigrated to the United States. First, he moved to New Jersey, then to Los Angeles, where he lived until 1952, well after the war. So with Niemoller's sermons published as the book God is my Fuhrer in 1941, we can deduce that Thomas Mann likely wrote this preface once stateside in New Jersey, and while Niemoller was in a concentration camp. But this preface should stand as itself an important document for the researching of this era. Thomas Mann writes in this preface, "To grasp the significance of the Hitler-inspired People's Tribunal's decision to release Pastor Martin Niemoller, charged with the abuse of the pulpit for political agitation and treason against both the state and the people, you must know something about its role in Nazi Germany. Fundamentally, he was guilty in the Nazi view. Hence, this was an amazing triumph for the man's personality. The nation, he had said, has no eternal being, though its everlastingness be repeated 1,000 times. Professing himself an evangelical Christian, he had openly rejected German Christianity. Against the deification of the state, this state above all, he had lodged his spiritual protest. He had declared, we are ready to give unto the world, without murmur, the things of the world. But if the world asks for the things that are God's, then we must manfully resist, lest we give the world the things that are God's, and for the sake of the comfortable life in a strange land, lose our home. This and many other statements in a similar vein, which can be read in these sermons, were undoubtedly political agitation. For everybody with a human heart in his breast becomes a political agitator when a creature like Hitler rises to power. That a Christian minister becomes one needs not astonish us. You have chosen, let us suppose, the calling of a theologian, of a minister, of a preacher of the gospel. Inspired by love and faith, you have become a pulpit orator, upon whose words hang many thousand simple souls. Politics are alien to you, not at all in your field, for they make up the world, while yours is the realm, as you conceive it, of the spiritual and the eternal. You are a purely religious person, quite ready to render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, but whose real domain is God, sin, redemption, death, and eternity. Then a rogue with effeminate hands rises up, and with the voice of a malicious, snappish cur roars amid great acclaim. State and nation are God, and I am state and nation. Therefore, I am God. Could you fail to contradict him? You would have to contradict him, and so you would soon find yourself a political agitator. Inevitable though it would be, to be sure, nevertheless, the burden of guilt would not be upon you, but upon that rogue, because the borderline between religion and politics would have been wiped out. From a mere popular preacher until that hour, you would emerge a political figure day by day, without even realizing it, and your church would loom up as a center of political opposition. This is the story of Pastor Niemoller. Yet it is significant that he was set free by a National Socialist so-called People's Tribunal, a remnant of decency, of humanity, of respect for manly courage, and sincere conviction must have lingered on and prevailed in the hearts of the small majority of the judges long calloused to injustice, and even among the party officials who sat in overwhelming numbers in the tribunal, a remnant of respect for a force you must not touch, even though, as a Nazi knows only too well, bludgeons and leather whips can flog into strips every kind of force, however manly, and reduce it into a heap of whimpering pain. Indeed, this is all that a Nazi knows. It is the special Nazi discovery. Nevertheless, the People's Tribunal decided to set him free, to give him back to his parishioners. Fear of his great popularity, of the mass of his admirers and followers, may have played its part in the decision, for at least 100 of his colleagues were in jail and forbidden to preach, while his own church services were permitted under the surveillance of the secret police. In a word, the verdict was announced, and the pastor was about to return to his home, which love and gratitude had transformed into a flower garden. He never laid eyes on that home again. The Gestapo arrested him again at the back door of the courthouse, and he was taken to a concentration camp, where he was confined today, a fate more cruel than if he had been sentenced to a regular prison. The seizure of the exonerated man was by special personal order of the Fuhrer of all Germany, the mighty Herr Hitler. No trace of decency, no respect for human dignity and manly courage, such as his People's Tribunal has shown, existed in the breast of an incredibly vile wretch. Never has the slightest impulse of magnanimity stirred the depraved soul. His success and dizzy rise to power from the pitiable plight of a bootless ne'er-do-well, which a topsy-turvy fate has granted him, did not moderate his hatred or his seething vindictiveness, nor did it enrich his soul by so much as a spark of clemency and mercy, or justice to his prostrate enemies. To these he begrudges death, that indeed would be mercy. He inflicts upon them, and it delights his satanic and depraved heart, lifelong torture, physical humiliation, and rape, the destruction of their personalities, the sapping of their brains, insanity, beggarly senility. It makes no difference whether it be a private citizen, a former official of the German Republic, heads of defeated nations like Schosnig, or whole peoples and races like the Czechs, Poles, and Jews. Let us not forget that a National Socialist People's Tribunal is a rather crude institution. There is small concern for justice. Trials are brief. Yet even such a tribunal could not bring itself to condemn Martin Niemoller. Hitler, however, turned him over, this man who was officially declared innocent, to the flayers and torturers of his underworld police. A mere fraction of this terrible and arbitrary miscarriage of justice, a half, a third, nay, an eighth part, would ordinarily have aroused the indignation of the civilized world and caused it to break relations with the regime that had perpetrated such a crime, isolating it and shaming it in the eyes of its own people, and so bringing about its downfall. Feeble and fearful, blind and imperturbable civilized world. Nothing of the sort occurred. Germany was so sovereign, as long as its new rulers kept external peace, daily renewing their promises to keep it. All that happened within Germany was a matter of complete indifference to us neutral and peace-loving spectators. If you spoke of human responsibilities, or of the duty we all have to safeguard the foundations of Western civilization, you were likely to be accused of being a resentful refugee. At all events, a warmonger. No war was wanted. What was wanted, at most, was the business in war munitions. Poor, brainless, civilized world. Apparently, it was unaware that internal and external politics are bound up together, and that no government behaves within its own borders, as did the German Reich without, sooner or later, and probably sooner, showing a similar face to the outside world. It did not see, nor did it wish to see, that everything done at home by the National Socialist regime, not only the gigantic war rearmament, but everything else tended toward war, inevitable war. Stupidity was at the root of the world's lack of indignation, its lack of mercy. It failed to see that such crimes as were committed against Niemoller served only to usher in what has afflicted the world now. Why did the historic confessor of God and of the liberty of Christian man have to be banished from sight to a concentration camp? The reason is that Hitler's regime's sole aim and goal was to fashion the German nation by every possible device and method for a total war, and it did not wish to be obstructed in this effort. Pastor Niemoller obstructed it. He obstructed it most effectively. Hence, his acquittal by his most cynical jury helped him not at all. He had to be annihilated. Is it too much to say that the civilized world should have taken his case to heart? This book contains his last sermons, the sermons of the time of his struggle, several delivered under Gestapo surveillance. I have read them with feelings, sympathy is too weak a word, akin to reverence, with the same emotion that moved his listeners in the overcrowded nave when they were delivered. Their delivery led to most unusual scenes, to such anachronisms as people falling on their knees outside of the church singing, "A mighty fortress is our God." In what modern country has such a thing happened so strange and lacking in precedent? Under the intolerable pressure of calumny and violence, stereotyped habits and empty routine, which had lost their stimulus to thought, were whipped up to a completely new, original, and burningly real immediate life of their own. And so, of a sudden, amid the sober cares of the contemporary world, lifted the people to perform unusual acts. The gospel itself had been renewed in the breast of this man. He, who thought he knew it, had discovered it once again with deep emotion, and his experience spread to his congregation. The gospel was no longer word and tradition and thoughtful exegesis. It was experience, life, immediate happening, In their language alone, these sermons have a great immediacy, which, though prepared and premeditated, and no doubt pondered, still pour forth as though they were improvisations that have sloughed off the hallmark of written or literary speech. But it is not this immediacy that I refer, rather to such oft-repeated phrases as, "When I read the word today, this word became really new to me. Only in these days has it become clear to me. Only today do I understand what the Lord Jesus Christ means when he says, 'Do not hide your light under a bushel,' and so on." You will find in these sermons an extraordinary psychological and significant radicalism, now more than ever, understanding the whole pathetic failure of a life that ends in utter abandonment at the cross. An end which is no longer a tragedy in human terms, but infinitely sad, losing itself in the jest of Roman soldiers. It is at an end that evermore spells triumph, the victory over the world, the apotheosis. All this is here seen anew with soul-shaking vehemence, felt anew, experienced anew. Nothing that resembles a cliché, that is merely good-natured, palliative, or devotional, is tolerated. The Bible is never devotional. Pious moods, even loyalty to our convictions and manly courage, are called idols. One must not confuse them with faith, which alone yields us strength to endure the way to Calvary. And this way is no promenade. Pious phrases are of no avail. What about the happy and comforted in the faith? We see today that this matter of a happy and comforted faith is no child's play. That it is not enough to quote passages from the Bible, and that we do not go far with a little Protestant enthusiasm and our habitual measure of optimism, and that we have reached the point where we cannot resist with our own strength alone. In brief, everything has become new and utterly serious, and there is no deeper seriousness than this. Niemoller was a naval officer, a submarine commander, before he was called to the pulpit. His unconditional religious obedience, his complete readiness, stems from his military tradition. They are military virtues carried over to his new calling. One does not have to be fond of militarism in order to respect and admire its symbolic forms of embodiment. The fact that Hitler, who constantly harps on heroism, did not see or honor Niemoller's soldierly qualities, makes his actions against him particularly repulsive. We have received our commission from him, who is the light of the world, his sermons tell us. He does not need us as wicks. He can take other wicks as well, other men on whom to set up his light, to announce God's world loudly and clearly. That is our service. One should note that the word service, it is meant in a military religious sense, but it is no business of ours whether the church continues to live, and it is not put to death, or whether the light is blown out or not. It is the concern of the highest chief, Jesus' concern, and all we have to do is our duty. He that findeth his life shall lose it. Surely the practical meaning of this is, I must speak thus once again today, for perhaps I shall no longer be able to do this next Sunday. I have to tell you this today once again, for who knows what the next Sunday may bring forth. It was the sermon before last. 2 Sundays later, his pulpit stood empty. Here's a man who went his way to the cross with full awareness of the terror of that day. For he saw the cross as the world-eclipsing symbol, representing highest triumph in the midst of the deepest disgrace. But did he not, even so, underestimate the horror of the cross? It is terrible enough to fall into the hands of men, but to fall into the clutches of the Nazis, that is something far worse. Nobody knows whether Martin Niemoller is alive today. I mean whether what is left of him has any semblance of his former self. Perhaps he is nothing but a human hulk, his back scarred with scars from flogging, a ghostly reflection of himself, turned into a drooling idiot by brain-decaying dope slipped into his soup, knowing nothing, understanding nothing. I cannot tell, but this is how the Nazis love to see their enemies. It is very likely, therefore, that they have done this to him. When he was still preaching, he once said, "There is no man who can boast of having stood, with his help, by the Lord Jesus. There is no man who can boast of having made the Lord Jesus' death easier. Boasting stops before the cross. Nothing is left there but human malice, which seeks to hide itself behind a shred of virtue, and is therefore starkly revealed as the innermost essence of our human nature. Before the cross, all noble humanity, or what we call noble humanity, fails. Now too, without blasphemy, before his cross, all boasting stops. His cross too spells the failure of humanity, of the civilized world. Nobody came to his aid. Nobody intervened. Everyone, including the nations of the world, thought only of himself, hid behind the threadbare rags and patches of neutrality, and looked on while the others were nailed to the cross, one after the other. I really believe that not since the days of Golgotha has the inertia of the human heart revealed itself more criminally and lamentably than in our days. He is less than human who does not long for the day when Martin Niemoller will walk the earth once more a free man. When the hymn, "A mighty fortress is our God," will resound, not from the depths of tribulation, but from a grateful triumph and confirmed faith. Yet the dungeon of this martyr is also a symbol. Now that that has come to pass, which must needs have come to pass, thanks to the apathy of all of us, and now that everything we prize is at its stake, will the Christian world, calling itself civilized as it does, have the physical and above all the moral courage to break asunder the walls of the dungeon. Signed, Thomas Mann.
The army that Germany has built up in 4 years swings in honor past Hungary's strongman Admiral Horthy. The young men of the new German Reich welded into a mighty war machine.
There were really some good references and quotes from the sermons that Mann included in that preface to this book. As I've read through these sermons, I looked to find anything that he might have said that would have alerted those watching from the back of the congregation. Not all the sermons have a political message, but watching the dates written under each sermon title tick closer and closer to Niemoller's arrest date gives an ominous feeling. In this next section of our episode, I'd like to go over some of the statements I found in these last 28 sermons that really stood out to me, especially as I read from this man that I knew drew closer and closer to the concentration camp each Sunday. His last 28 sermons before his arrest starts on November 22nd, 1936. Throughout the sermons, we see many calls for the congregation to avoid hate, and several sermons call out the German church. But it's his sermons from 1937 that really start to show the progression of his opposition and documents his public announcements in the lead-up to his arrest. In a sermon titled New Year, which was delivered January 1st, 1937, we see the first signs of what is to come from Niemoller in his last sermons. He identifies how 1936 was bad for the church, and 1937 will be a fight. Early on, he states, "As a Christian congregation, that is, if we take seriously the brotherhood in which we are placed, are dragging the whole burden of the past year with its full weight over into the next year. And this burden has in its last few days not only not become lighter, but has grown considerably heavier and more oppressive. If during the past year the preaching of the gospel has been banished from the public life of our people, in the last few days a violent attack has been launched against the preaching within the church." He explains that during the past year, the de-Christianizing of the theological facilities has been practically completed. During the past few weeks, the self-help of the evangelical community for the instruction of their preachers has been destroyed through the closing by the police of the theological schools, and the ban on the compensatory lectures of the confessional church, and the young student brethren have been threatened with exclusion from all German universities, and the loss of all the rights to a position in the service of the church, if they take any further part in such lectures. And if in 1936 the fight against the clear profession of faith in Jesus of Nazareth as the one Christ and Savior was carried on in such a way that sand was strewn in man's eyes, and attempts were made to reach the goal by way of negotiations and discussions, and only in individual cases where that failed was recourse made to expulsions, on the threshold of the year 1937, we hear of the arrest of Pastor Eisen in Fechingen, because he refused to obey a police order to leave his congregation and give up his post as pastor. And we also hear that Advocate Bunk in Glogau has been arrested as president of the Council of Brethren there and thrown into a concentration camp. But dear friends, he continues, we must know that all these things are but a small section, a mere part of the burden which lies upon us, and which we cannot cast off. This sermon was led with a reading of Psalm 92, which first verse reads, "It is a good thing to give thanks unto the Lord, and to sing praises unto thy name, O Most High." Niemoller goes on to comfort his congregation with reminders that they have reason to give thanks to and praise God because He has given them eyes of faith and promises to make all things new. The religious phrasing that he later uses, calling their opposition blasphemers, could easily get lost in a normal sacred versus secular rhetoric from the church. But don't forget that the context of all this is the state doing things like removing pastors from their congregations and placing them in concentration camps. "Behold the Lamb of God" was the title of his sermon delivered the next week, January 9th, 1937. He leads this sermon with the reading of John 1, which is John's recounting of the calling of the disciples. In the sermon, Niemoller states that the question arises as to whether the simple narrative, which has little that is evangelical about it, though, of course, it may probably have had its special meaning for the disciple, can help us to establish our faith more firmly and to have a clearer understanding of our service as disciples. Niemoller talks about being the disciple of a man who surely does not conform with our present-day ideal of the perfect man. A little further down, he states, "We seek the one who will fight actively, who will lead the new idea to freedom or will defeat it and send it packing." It is from the result of his intervention that we expect salvation and deliverance. And he repeats the question, Jesus of Nazareth, as he looks at the Savior that men hope for. He continues, "Since men have hoped for a Savior and dreamt of a Savior, it has never occurred to anyone that the Savior might be Jesus of Nazareth. Men looked upon the Emperor Augustus as a Savior in his time, praising him as a deliverer of the world and honoring him as God. But Jesus of Nazareth? Today men talk with the exuberance of religious veneration about the Fuhrer of our nation, who has taught us to have faith once again." This is similar to something I've talked about from time to time. Faith is typically used in reference exclusively to God, and our hope in God's promises. But as Pastor Niemoller points out, that faith can be put in a leader of their country. As he continues this sermon, he uses his time to remind the congregation of where we should have our faith: the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news of Jesus Christ. Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. In the sermon, "The Dumb Spake," which he delivered February 28th, 1937, Niemoller read from Luke 11, verses 14 through 28. It's the story of Jesus casting out demons, but is then accused of casting out the demons by the power of Beelzebub. Jesus corrects them by showing them how it's not logical for Satan to be divided against himself, and explains how cast-out spirits will return to places with greater strength. Niemoller then uses this passage to illustrate that Christians of the church are the mute that has had the evil spirits removed, but strongly implies that the church leaders of their day became well-meaning neutrals in their faith, and will either be numbered with Jesus or against him. In this sermon, I hear a somewhat subtle call of the Third Reich as a stronger evil returning to the church that was once the mute man. And any church leaders that do not fight against the Reich will eventually, as he says, in 5 years or 5 months, will be numbered against Jesus. But even here, Niemoller is also calling out his congregation to have courage and speak out. In hindsight, we can see him referencing his famous statement of speaking out for those that the Reich came against, and that it will be 5 months from this sermon that he will be arrested, showing that he will be numbered with Jesus. On April 27, 1937, Niemoller delivered the sermon titled Nevertheless, which started with a reading of 2 Timothy 2, verses 8 through 14. This is a pastoral letter from Paul to Timothy, and you can see how Niemoller shares a sense of the same tone that he finds in this passage. After reading it, Niemoller points out that the apostle writes the words which we have just heard, dear brethren, to this pupil and fellow worker, Timothy, as a last will and testament, so to speak. It is, however, not the testament of a man who looks back contently on the results and fruits of his indefatigable life work, and hands over his task with trust and confidence to the best of his fellow workers. But the position in the second epistle to Timothy is this: the apostle has grown very, very lonely and wonders if his life work is threatened with destruction before his very eyes. While the witness and messenger of the gospel, the apostle Paul, is kept bound in prison, the congregation is quarreling about words, about trifles, which can lead only to confusion and disorganization. Thus, the picture of the young Christian church, which is here presented to us, is a very, very melancholy one. And the human mood in which Paul writes to Timothy is by no means happy and confident either, with regard to coming events and their development. And precisely because it is so, dear friends, and not otherwise, we all have reason to pay particular attention to these words addressed by the apostle to his fellow worker and successor, as though they were words addressed to us today, to us who find ourselves under the same spiritual oppression and under the same burden as the apostle, and became the same oppression, the same burden afflicting us today. Niemoller then asks about the status of their church, the confessing church, which we've gone over as an opposition to the German state church. He seeks to encourage them, though, while pointing out those similarities he sees between the church of the apostolic days and the church of that day in Germany. He says they don't need to reference the church's oppression in history because we have all that directly before our eyes. We can see how God's word is being put into chains and imprisoned, from the list of undesirable books to the prison cells which close behind the messengers of Jesus Christ. He then references what he calls the Fuhrer's decree of last August. I had trouble finding exactly which decree this is referring to, but Niemoller says, according to which there were to be no major trials in ecclesiastical lawsuits, has been liquidated, and that proceedings have again been instituted not only against Catholic, but also against evangelical ministers and laymen. Like I said, I'm not sure exactly what decree was made, or held, or overturned, but there were several agreements between the churches and the Nazis during the 1930s. In 1933, there was a treaty between the Nazis and the Vatican called the Reich Concordance. It guaranteed the rights of the Catholic Church in Germany, but included the agreement that bishops would be ready to take an oath of loyalty to the German Reich, and that all clergy had to abstain from working in and for political parties. It is said that this was to eliminate the Church's influence by restricting it to purely religious activities, and that the Nazis violated their end of the agreement from the start. This was mentioned a little bit in that Time article that we went over, and there's also documentation out there that shows that Pastor Niemoller spoke with Hitler very early on during his rise to power and the promises that he was making to various churches and things like that. But this particular one in 1933 with the Catholic churches, it led to a protest within the Catholic Church. And in August of 1936, the month Niemoller is referencing, the German bishops requested an encyclical letter to deal with the situation between the Church and the Reich. By the next month, November of 1936, during a meeting with a cardinal, Hitler disclosed that there would be more pressure put on the Church if it didn't more enthusiastically collaborate with the Reich. On the 10th of March, 1937, the bishops got their letter that they requested, titled, "With Burning Concern." This letter was secretly circulated to the German churches from Pope Pius XI. It was written in German rather than the standard Latin, and condemned the German government's violations of the 1933 treaty. For fear of this letter being censored, it was kept a secret until the 21st of March, which was Palm Sunday, and one of the church's busiest Sundays. So by this sermon from Niemoller in April, we can see that things were really heating up between the churches and the state. On June 19th, 1937, Niemoller delivered the sermon titled, "The Salt of the Earth." He read from Matthew 5, verse 13 through 16, in which Jesus declares that his followers are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. After the scripture reading, Niemoller spent 5 minutes reading a list of more than 70 names of people that had been arrested, evicted, or forbidden to speak by the Reich. As he put it, those who for the gospel's sake are hampered in their freedom or robbed of it. He also points out that the list included names of pastors and church members, names of men and of women, names of young and of old. He then asks several questions relating to something he calls the Fuhrer's word, and asks if it still holds good. After he asks each question, and then relates the current events that detail the arrest and silencing of these names, he responds, "The question as to whether the word of the Fuhrer holds good is answered in the negative." He then relates how, even in this dark time, the reading of this passage and the preceding verses from the Sermon on the Mount gave him a feeling of inward relief. Verses 11 and 12 read, "Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." He then points out that there appears to be no break between the persecution of the community of Jesus Christ and the verses about being salt and light of the world. One thing that I really like is that he points out in this metaphor that it is not the responsibility of the church to determine where the salt goes, but that the salt doesn't lose its savor, so that the Lord Jesus Christ, who is, as one might say, the cook in charge of this great brew, can utilize the salt for his purposes. He continues this thought with the light of the world, but I want to point out one last thing he said that really stuck out to me, worrying about the salt being salty versus worrying about how it's employed. He says, "The gospel must remain the gospel. The church must remain the church. The creed must remain the creed. Evangelical Christians must remain evangelical Christians. And we must not, for heaven's sake, make a German gospel out of the gospel. We must not, for heaven's sake, make a German church out of Christ's church. We must not, for God's sake, make German Christians out of the evangelical Christians." These are very brave, passionate, and encouraging words for a man that is watching his brethren be arrested and silenced for speaking out against the state, and no doubt knowing he had police in his midst listening on. But it was his faith that strengthened him, as can be noted by the line from his sermon about the salt and Jesus. If the salt remains salt, we may trust him with it. He will use it in such a way that it becomes a blessing. With that, he continued to encourage his congregation to continue being salt and light by encouraging them to speak out and speak the gospel. On June 27, 1937, Martin Niemoller gave his final sermon before his arrest on July 1st. That would be just 4 days later. The sermon was titled Gamaliel, which was the name of the Pharisee in that morning's scripture reading of Acts 5, verses 33 through 44. This passage is part of a larger story of Peter and some other apostles being arrested for preaching, and after being miraculously released from prison, continued to preach in the same spot the very next day. Of course, the high priest and the Sadducees and Israel's Senate are alerted to this, so the captain and officers go to get them. And it's funny because it specifically points out that they didn't use force because they were afraid of being stoned by the people. But the apostles go before the high priest and all the other important people gathered there, and they have it pointed out that they were strictly told not to teach in Jesus' name. Then Peter delivers the infamous line, "We must obey God rather than men." Obviously, this enraged everyone, but it is the Pharisee Gamaliel that gives the order for the apostles to be put outside while he addresses the council. He addresses them in verse 39, to keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or this undertaking is of man, it will fail. But if it's from God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found opposing God. After that, they call the apostles back in, they beat them, charge them again to not speak in the name of Jesus, and then let them go. But according to verse 41 and 42, when the apostles left, they rejoiced that they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. And every day in the temple and from house to house, they did not cease teaching and preaching that the Christ is Jesus. So, in this last sermon, Niemoller recounts the events in this passage, as we just went over, pointing out that we should have gratitude to Gamaliel because it was his intervention that the apostles were set free, and that Christ's community in Germany that day also wished for a clever, respectable, and godly man such as Gamaliel to call for caution, truthfulness, and reverence with regard to God's will. He says that if that man were there, standing up, perhaps people would not be so ready to carry out executions like the ones done earlier that week for incitement to insubordination. He then recounts that a newspaper deliberately misrepresented the leave that Pastor Asmussen took as escaping arrest. Niemoller proclaims to the congregation that he advised Asmussen to leave, but that he had not been subpoenaed, and if he had been, Asmussen would show up if he were and if a warrant was issued. Niemoller then ends his explanations of these events with, "So all the authorities concerned know what's what." And there is an exclamation point at the end of that sentence in the transcript of this sermon. He then states, "We have as little thought and as little hope as the apostles had of escaping from the clutches of the powers that be by our own efforts. And we have certainly as little intention as they had of obeying the human command to keep silent regarding what the Lord our God orders us to say. For as long as the world shall last, one must obey God rather than men." He then relates Gamaliel's cautionary advice specifically to the situation of arresting and martyring pastors in Germany. But Niemoller also reminds the congregation that even if that happens, even if this new Gamaliel is listened to, the apostles were let go, but not without a beating and not without a new ban on their preaching. He then warns for the congregation to not be deceived by Gamaliel's advice to the council. "If it be of men, it will come to naught, but if it be of God, ye cannot overcome it." He says that the statement is well-intentioned, but to not be tempted to look upon human counsel and human work, to look upon what is visible, upon the result, and to found our faith in some way, as to say, upon practical experience. He explains that when trouble and trials come, we are too apt to be tempted to conclude from the sorrows through which we are passing. So everything is going wrong after all. So God is not with us. So the world does not believe in God. So the work for which we stand is not from God. So it is not worth bothering about the matter. He illustrates all of this with recounting the cross. Dear friends, there lies a great danger. We must not forget that God brings about our salvation through the cross of his Son, not through Christ's success, but through his death. We must not forget that he bestows this salvation upon us by letting us hear and believe the message of the cross. But if we were to agree with Gamaliel, we would look at the cross as a failure and therefore a work of men. But he continues, the gospel, the word alone, says, it is precisely here that God's love triumphs, and it is precisely here that God reveals himself through his word and Holy Spirit, and bestows faith upon the believer. Here is God's counsel and God's work, and he who believes receives of this counsel and this faith. So he keeps driving home this idea that the church and the world see this failure and success differently, and reminds them that the verse from the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. And to tie together these verses with his message to the congregation, he recounts a lot of recent attacks against the church from the Nazis. I'm going to read the remainder of the sermon from here, which is a large portion because it is so historically important and seems even more relevant when hearing these thoughts by the pastor during the last week before his arrest and eventual internment in a concentration camp. The oppression is growing, and anyone who has had to submit to the tempter's machine gun fire during this last week thinks differently from what he did even 3 weeks ago. I have in mind how, on Wednesday, the secret police forced their way into a locked church at Frederickwerder and in the vestry arrested 8 members of the Reich Council of Brethren who were holding a meeting there, and took them away. I have in mind how yesterday at Saarbrücken, 6 women and a male member of the congregation were taken into custody because they were distributing an election leaflet of the confessional church, at the request of the Council of the Brethren. I say to you, anyone who knows these things and who has actually had to suffer these things is not far from uttering the prophet's words. Indeed, such a one would fain say with the prophet, it is enough, no, it is too much. Now, O Lord, take away my life. And anyone who has had the experience I had the night before last at an evening communion service and sees beside him nothing less than 3 young members of the secret police who have come in their official capacity to spy upon the community of Jesus Christ in their praying, singing, and preaching. 3 young men who were also assuredly baptized once upon a time in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, and who also assuredly vowed loyalty to their Savior at the confirmation altar, and whose office and duty it now is to set traps for the community of Jesus Christ. Anyone who sees that cannot escape so easily from the shame of the church. He cannot pass the matter off with a pious phrase and an inspired protest. Such a sight may cost him a sleepless and most certainly a restless night, and he may even cry from the depths of his despair, Lord, have mercy upon me. And we are remembering that over yonder, in the Annenkirche, the pulpit stands empty today because our brother and pastor, Fritz Müller, along with 47 other Christian brothers and sisters of our evangelical church, is being kept in custody because of church matters. And at the same time, we remember that in the church, even in the so-called confessional church, and even in our own congregation, people are saying they are possibly not quite innocent, They probably have something political chalked up against them. And now the press has begun its defamatory campaign. And in the week which begins today, the first summary proceedings will take place. Yes, dear friends, what then? Shall we be happy and comforted, or despondent and intimidated? There is in truth nothing left for us but to put our trust in the word of the crucified Savior, and to cling to this crucified Savior himself, and to learn to say, in simple and therefore assured faith, the ABC of Christian belief. I can rejoice because within my heart thy name and cross alone shed their radiant beams continually. And it may take some time for the knowledge we can be happy to become the truth. We are happy, and for us actually to be as happy as the apostles, who departed from the presence of the council rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for Christ's sake. It may cost us a considerable effort to rejoice because we must suffer. This is not an easy path to tread, nor is this walk a pleasure outing. It is an exposed road, and those who follow it are told, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. It may be a good thing that this is no pleasure excursion, and that the way of the cross cannot be learned overnight. It may be just as well that the road is long and difficult. Otherwise, we might confuse our pious moods, our loyalty to our convictions, our manly courage, and whatever else the idols may be called, with faith, which is gracious gift from God, and which he bestows upon us through the Holy Ghost. But as this long and difficult road, we may learn, in the bitterness and tribulation, to pay attention to the word of our Lord. And so we may begin in earnest to hear and preach and teach the word of the cross, the gospel of Jesus Christ, without ceasing. Our duty today, and we have no other, is that we should be like the apostles, who, when a new embargo was laid upon their preaching, went forth and did not cease to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, the message of the cross. And we can preach it only by learning it. And we can teach it only by listening to it ourselves. For it is by this word, and by this word alone, that our faith lives. Our faith that is joy. And from this faith flows the joy that keeps us upright beneath the cross and steadies us upon our feet. This joy is happy beneath the cross and confesses that it owes its life to the cross. Dear friends, man does not live by bread alone, but by the word of God. And so we can only pray with the disciples, Lord, give thy community, give thy Christian people, now and all times, such bread. And that concludes the last sermon Martin Niemoller preached before being arrested 4 days later. He carried this message into prison in 1937 and into the concentration camps until his liberation in 1945. He continued as salt and light wherever Christ put him during those hard years, until his passing in 1984. It's easy to look at German footage from the 1940s and say, nationalism is bad. But many will make excuses for that sort of nationalism. Distinguishing between different nationalisms is really only something we can do in hindsight. We look at the concentration camps, the persecutions, the murder, the allegiances, and we say, well, that's a bad form of nationalism. But there was a time that Nazi nationalism was looked at with admiration from all over the world. So it shouldn't be a crazy thought to think that the pride of the German people wouldn't be so strongly affected. Germany was pulled out of a terrible economic depression and a position of global shame, and rose very quickly to the position of a world power. This is triumph and victory in a nation's eyes, not to mention the sign of a blessing to those that intertwine their faith and nationalism. I can't help looking at the history of the church and this particular era as one example after another of the inevitable chaos that comes with the church aligning itself with the state. And this alignment isn't just in the offices of pastors and politicians. This bit of history that we've studied today shows the dangers of nationalism down to the very individual. Martin Niemoller was not an exception to other pastors that would eventually abandon the German church during the rise of the Third Reich. In the earliest years, they embraced the rhetoric of the Nazi Party. In an interview for the National Jewish Monthly that was published in 1941, Niemoller had this response to the question of why he ever supported the Nazi Party to begin with. I find myself wondering about that too. I wonder about it as much as I regret it. Still, it is true that Hitler betrayed me. I had an audience with him as a representative of the Protestant Church, shortly before he became Chancellor in 1932. Hitler promised me, on his word of honor, to protect the Church and not to issue any anti-church laws. He also agreed not to allow pogroms against the Jews, assuring me as follows: there will be restrictions against the Jews, but there will be no ghettos, no pogroms in Germany. I really believed, given the widespread anti-Semitism in Germany at that time, that Jews should avoid aspiring to German positions or seats in the Reichstag. There were many Jews, especially among the Zionists, who took a similar stand. Hitler's assurance satisfied me at the time. On the other hand, I hated the growing atheistic movement, which was fostered and promoted by the Social Democrats and the Communists. Their hostility toward the church made me pin my hopes on Hitler for a while. I am paying for that mistake now, and not me alone, but thousands of other persons like me. The experiences leading up to and during his imprisonment would change many perspectives of Pastor Niemoller. Prior to becoming such an outspoken resistor of the Nazis, he was a nationalist and an anti-Semite. Obviously, that all changed. Even in 1982, on his 90th birthday, he stated that he had started his political career as an ultra-conservative who wanted the Kaiser to come back. And now I am a revolutionary. I really mean that. If I live to be 100, I shall maybe be an anarchist. He died 2 years later, not making it all the way to 100, but I'm sure everyone listening can appreciate his sentiment. If something like that should ever happen again, it's my hope that studies like this will bring hope, inspiration, and courage to those Christians that will be inclined to refuse the draw to nationalism, and will reject this idea that we can have Christian nationalism. We can also learn from the past and not aid the rise of the rhetoric to later regret it. Martin Niemoller survived the concentration camps and lived well past World War II. Some of his actions and statements have outlived him in the world's memory. Hopefully they'll never die. The full extent of his resistance, which was completely a result of his allegiance to Christ, should continue in the memory of the Church. Hopefully this episode will help with that. Don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian podcast on whatever podcatcher you're using. I'll have links in the show notes to some of the resources that I discussed today, as well as links to the prior episodes that go over the Barmen Declaration, the atomic bombs in World War II, and the verses of obeying God rather than men. Don't forget to subscribe to the Anarcho-Christian podcast on whatever podcatcher you're using. If you're not sure where to find us, visit anarchochristian.com/subscribe. There you'll find links to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Android, Google Play, Spotify, and YouTube. If you're enjoying these podcasts, please consider letting us know by leaving a 5-star rating and review on iTunes, or wherever you catch the episodes. Also, like and share the episode on Facebook or the other social media sites. You can support this show with a monthly donation through Patreon or Subscribestar, or a one-time donation through PayPal. You can visit us on those sites, or you can visit the Support the Show tab on anarchochristian.com. That will take you to a page where you'll find links to Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. Thank you again to all the patrons that helped with this episode, with getting the book, and with the other support that you sent me throughout the month. I really appreciate your support. So I think that's it for today. Grace and peace. No king but Christ.
He cried out to God, won't you help them to believe? This power is illusion, the need to rule is greed. Your love and your light is really all they need. It's really all we need.
Thank you for listening to the Anarcho-Christian Podcast. Subscribe to our email notifications at anarchochristian.com, like us on facebook.com/anarchochristian, and follow us on Twitter at anarchoxp. Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube to join us next time as we continue to evaluate the relationship between the Christian and the state. No king but Christ.
God said there's a season for every single thing. The people.
Then a rogue rises up, roars amid great acclaim. State and nation are God, and I am state and nation. Therefore, I am God. Could you fail to contradict him? You would have to contradict him, and so you would soon find yourself a political agitator. Inevitable though it would be, to be sure, nevertheless, the burden of guilt would not be upon you, but upon that rogue. Because the borderline between religion and politics would have been wiped out. From a mere popular preacher until that hour, you would emerge a political figure day by day, without even realizing it, and your church would loom up as a center of political opposition. This is the story of Pastor Niemoller. Not you, Herr Hitler, but God is my Fuhrer.